So on behalf of the executive of Saanich North and the Islands, Adams Riding Association, let me welcome you here. And let me acknowledge that we're on the territory of the Saanich people. In fact, I'm over at Saturna on one of the islands, which were part of that broad community. And when I mentioned to the folks locally that Andy was going to be doing this evening with us, they all remembered their walks and talks with Andy when he would come to visit Saturna. So I know that there are some of them going to be on this evening. Andy, I was just mentioning to you earlier, you're on the BC bestseller list. You entered at #1. You have been #1 for 18 weeks. That is amazing and spectacular. So we're about to start. I'm going to hand over to Adam. And I just want to remind folks that we host these evenings to build community. And in building community, we like to support our communities as well. And Andy has selected 2 places where if you're so moved, you can make a contribution. One is to the Kingfisher Forest, and he'll tell you more about that on Pender. And the other is for the refugees in Ukraine. So just a reminder as we get started, Paul will put some links in the chat as we move through the evening. And please give generously. Both are wonderful causes. Adam, let me switch it over to you. And thank you very much for joining us once again, Andy.
Awesome. All right, thanks a lot, Tex, and welcome to, I haven't had a chance to escape the legislature today, so I'm joining everybody from the traditional territory of our, or actually the current territory as well, of our relatives, Lekwungen-speaking people, my relatives from Saanich and Esquimalt here in the BC legislature. This is where I spend a good portion of half of my life in the legislative assembly office here. Right across from, right over there is the Minister of Finance, and right over there is the Premier. So they keep us close. Let's just put it that way. Andy, it's wonderful to see you this evening. I have always enjoyed the time that we've spent together on the front lawns, on the front steps of the legislature, as we've been together standing up for forests and, well, standing up for the right things to be standing up for in this province, sane policy making and nature and biodiversity. And I really do look forward to your presentation this evening. Andy was a two-time candidate for the BC Greens in Esquimalt Metchosin. Andy's a Metchosin councillor, a District of Metchosin councillor, and a specialist, or a man who knows a lot about mushrooms. Let's put it that way. What is it? What is the actual term for that, Andy?
I like man who knows a lot about mushrooms. You could say mycologist.
Mycologist, a person with a lot of mushroom knowledge. We've done birds and now we've done mushrooms in this speaker series this year. So this is fantastic to have you here, Andy. And before I expose my lack of knowledge, I'm going to open my mind up to learning this evening. So I'm going to turn my camera off and listen along with the rest. And when you're done your presentation, I will rejoin you. We will take questions. You can either put your questions in the Q&A or you can leave them in the chat. And I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible once Andy's done his presentation. But right now, it's over to you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Adam. And I will start with the poster that was used to advertise tonight's talk. Tex or Adam or Linda, could you just confirm that you can see this fine?
Yeah, it looks good, Andy.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you tonight. I'm honored. We've recently pulled together a riding association for Esquimalt Machosen. As Adam mentioned, I was the Green Party candidate in the last two provincial elections. I finished third and then second, so I daren't run again. The trend seems entirely too ominous. I've been asked to give a presentation that will be probably about 45 minutes long, which should allow us plenty of time for questions, discussion, and general chat at the end. And I was asked to talk about fungi and forest ecology. So I'm just, oh yes, yeah. So I'm so happy they used this picture. I sent them too. I was hoping they wouldn't use this picture of me from the Whistler Fungus Among Us Festival a few years back. I'm sure you'll agree most people look best with a Cortinarius mushroom tucked behind their ear. The fisheye lens, I'm not sure. So I'm going to talk tonight about fungi and forest ecology, but I do a lot of writing and research and teaching. In the end, it's all about making positive changes in society. And a lot of the changes I'm interested in have to do with forestry. I'm a retired registered professional forester in British Columbia, worked as a forest ecologist for more than 3 decades, and land use. So I'm going to talk about fungi and forest ecology tonight, but I do some other stuff. So here I am in Fairy Creek there with a bunch of other municipal politicians trying to get arrested last June. And on the bottom right there was some fairly shifty looking characters, Andrea Innes from Ancient Forest, or formerly from Ancient Forest Alliance, myself on Andrea's right, and on her left some shifty looking character in a mask. I've also been involved in politics. Again, when I realized that I'd spent an awful lot of my career lobbying decision makers essentially to make informed decisions, or to make the sorts of decisions I wanted them to make. And oftentimes being unsuccessful, I thought, well, perhaps it's time to step up and see if I might become one of those decision makers. And so I'm now in my 7th year as a Machosen counselor. There I am with Machosen's council, not this one, but the previous one, just outside our municipal hall, and have been a candidate for the Green Party in the last 2 provincial elections. This one is from our last provincial election. However, I did start out some years ago when my hair was still dark, doing a master's in mycology, in the study of fungi. And in between, I've been involved in a number of books and courses and so forth, having to do with ecosystems and plants. But it's only fairly recently that I've managed to come back to my true love, which is mushrooms. So as Tex kindly mentioned, we came out with this Royal British Columbia Museum guide, The Mushrooms of British Columbia, that was published in September of 2021. So it's pretty new, and it's been selling very well. So the museum's very happy with that. And I'm quite happy with the way the book turned out too. And I won't say much more about it, other than I'm really proud that it's in the Royal BC Museum Handbook series, because they have published a lot of really well-respected books on different groups of organisms in British Columbia. And I grew up on some of these books. So it's great to finally be able to produce a book in the Royal BC Museum Handbook series. There were previous guides to mushrooms, in 1946 and in 1964. But just to give you an idea of how long ago that was, I remember when the 1976 version of the book on the right came out, and it was the first handbook, I'm pretty sure, published by the Royal BC Museum that featured that marvelous new invention, color photographs. So that was quite a long while ago. That one was about 170 pages, and the new book is over 500 pages. So we've learned an awful lot about mushrooms in the 45 or 50 years since that guide came out. Okay, so I wanted to talk about what fungi do in the fields and forests. I guess I'm talking about fungi and forest ecology, so primarily forests in British Columbia. I thought I'd start very briefly with an introduction to fungi, because not an awful lot of people spend a lot of their time enjoying the company of fungi. Biologists, I count myself among them, draw trees of life to explain how things are related. And so things that are closer to each other on these trees of life are more closely related. On the left, you can see at any textbook you look at will have a different display of these trees. So don't fret the details. On the left, you'll see that there are groups of what are called prokaryotes, called the eubacteria, most of the real bacteria, the archaea, a strange group of organisms that live in extreme environments like hot springs and salt flats and things like that. And then most things we would think of as living organisms, most multicellular organisms, the eukaryotes. That means they have a nucleus that contains their genetic material and other organelles. And among the eukaryotes, the three big groups are plants, animals, and fungi. So the first lesson in all of this, I think, is that the fungi aren't plants, they're not animals, they're a separate kingdom on the same level as, say, plants and animals. Okay, here's a whole bunch of names. This will be the test afterwards. No, just joking. But just to show you, up in the top left here, this is another way of arranging organisms by their genetic and presumed evolutionary relationships. Up in the top left, the green corner is plants. Up in the bottom, or down in the bottom right, the one that's labeled opisthocons or uniconts, that's a group that includes the animals and the fungi. And so something that's surprising to an awful lot of people is that if you look at that group on the bottom right there, there are the animals in the red box, there are the fungi. Animals, just about the closest relationship that animals have to any other group of organisms is to fungi, and vice versa. Which means that if you have a mushroom in your front yard, for example, it's much, much more closely related to you than it is to any plant. So fungi and animals, very close relatives. Almost all of the talk tonight is going to be on those first two groups, ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. And I will tell you what those are in a second. Mycetes just means fungi. So the ascomycetes are the fungi that have asci. The basidiomycetes are the fungi that have basidia, and so forth. That's what most of the talk's going to be about, but I'm first going to get rid of three groups that you'll probably never have opportunity to bump into in your life, but they're all around you. The zygomycetes, microsporidia, and chytrids, the other groups of fungi. Okay, we'll start with what are fungi. Let me see, did I? Oh yes, right, okay. I'm going to come back to that. So what are fungi in general? How do we characterize them? They have nuclei, so they're not bacteria. They're heterotrophic. What that means simply is that they can't make their own food like plants. Like animals, they have to obtain their food from other organisms. They are absorbent. They tend to suck that food up. They can be like amoebae in shape, little microscopic globules. They can be unicellular fungi we call yeast. And they are usually, and almost all the ones we'll talk about tonight are filamentous. Look at the bottom left. Those are filaments that are about 1/20th the width of a human hair. And that's what most fungi, all of the mushrooms, all the conchs and so forth are composed of. You can't see it. You need a very powerful microscope to see those because they're only about 5 microns in diameter. But that's what all of those fungi are made of. They generally don't move around much. The cell walls contain chitin, which is something a lot of insects do and no plants do. And most of them reproduce by various types of spores on the bottom right there. You could think of those as being kind of like seeds, but a lot simpler. So all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. So we have worldwide probably somewhere between 3 and 20 million species of fungi. We haven't got a clue whether it's 3 or 20. That's how well this group is known. But of all of them, perhaps a few tens of thousands are big enough that we can see them and we'll call them mushrooms. And the vast majority are microscopic. So that's why I say that all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. And even though they're microscopic, a lot of these creatures are very, very important. At the top left there, a blue cheese, which is cheese that has fungi growing through it. Fungi like the one illustrated on the top right there, that's a species of penicillium. The source of the first of the really successful modern antibiotics. But there are also species of penicillium that are used to make blue cheese blue. They have species names like Penicillium camembertii, Penicillium gorgonzolii, and so forth. And also, of course, the unicellular fungi that we call yeasts. If anybody is fond at all of baking or brewing, that group of fungi, while not mushrooms, are very good friends to humans. Okay, so let's go back to this group and look at the fungi that we're not going to talk about today. Zygomycetes on the left there are a group of largely microscopic decomposers. Probably the main place you would see them is if you have a bowl of strawberries or some other soft fruit that gets just a little too soft in your home and it develops a white fuzz on it, sometimes with black heads. That is a zygomycete, one of the sugar fungi. You'll oftentimes see that very stylish effect on dog shit as well. Those are zygomycetes. Microsporidia are unicellular parasites of animals. You almost certainly have some microsporidia in your digestive tract. You'll just have to take my word for it. They're microscopic. And chytrids are generally decomposers. We find them almost always in aquatic or water environments. They're sometimes called water molds. And they're largely an unknown group. That chytrid on the left there is the world's most famous chytrid, Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis. And it's the world's most famous chytrid, and I bet nobody here has heard of it. And this is the chytrid that has been linked in some studies to the worldwide decline of amphibians, this particular species. Anyway, 3 microscopic species most of you will probably never see in your life. So we're going to concentrate on this talk on ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. Let's start with basidiomycetes because most things you think of as mushrooms are basidiomycetes. There's a basidiomycete. These things are all named, as are all living organisms that I can think of. They're all grouped by how they reproduce sexually. And that's because biologists believe that that's evolutionarily conservative. That doesn't change much over evolutionary time. So it indicates relationships among organisms. So everything that reproduces sexually in the same fashion is generally fairly closely related. Basidiomycetes, in this case, if we looked microscopically at the gill surface, indicated by the red circle there, we would see thousands of these club-shaped structures with 4 points on the top bearing 4 spores. So this is a basidium, it's making basidiospores, and that's a basidiomycete. And just about everything you think of as a mushroom in the woods has these basidia making basidiospores, and so is a basidiomycete. There's the basidium, there's the basidiospore. The other major group is the ascomycetes. A lot of cup fungi, for example, or morels are ascomycetes. Again, if we look at the fruiting surface, in this case with the green circle, we see a whole bunch of these long sacs that each contain 8 spores inside them. So that's an ascus. Those are ascospores. And that's what makes these ascomycetes. The mushrooms, what we think of as mushrooms, are just the fruiting bodies of the fungus. Remember, the fungus is these microscopic threads that are growing in the soil or in the wood, or sometimes under your skin. If we start, for example, with these spores on the bottom left there, they germinate and grow into these tubes, which are called hyphae. If 2 compatible tubes come together, very romantic, compatible mating types, we call it, not exactly like male or female, but you can think of them that way. In some species, there are more than 100 mating types. Imagine a fungal singles bar, if you will. Very confusing. So up in the top left there, those microscopic threads grow throughout the soil or the wood or the tree or some creature, and they eat and they feed. And when they've got enough energy saved up, they will make something like a mushroom. And the purpose of the mushroom is to have basidia or asci and make spores that will then create another generation of mushrooms. And so think of the mushrooms then as just the sexual organs, the reproductive structures of the fungus. One of the big lessons from that is that if you have a favorite spot where you like to go and gather chanterelles, those chanterelles are there because the mycelium, the fungal threads in the soil are there, and they make mushrooms each year when conditions are good. Means you can go back to the same spot because the mushrooms, they're year round. You only know that it's there when it makes its mushrooms, but the fungus is there all year round. Just a quick word on mushrooms and poisoning. Over large chunks of the globe, people love mushrooms and mushrooming, and in some parts of the world, some parts of Asia, some parts of Eastern Europe, it's an important part of their culture, collecting and eating wild mushrooms. Not so in the British Isles, and so not so over a lot of North America, where a lot of the settlers came from the British Isles and brought their ideas with them. So we see here a British painter, of course, from 1813, The Last Gasp, or toadstools mistaken for mushrooms. There are poisonous mushrooms in British Columbia. Here's the last fatality that we've had from eating poison mushrooms in British Columbia. But I think it's important to put these things into context. if you're going to be picking and eating wild mushrooms, you should know what you're doing. But way more people have died in British Columbia from eating wild plants than from eating wild mushrooms. And yet people don't fear plants. According to the best records we could find, the number of people who have died in recorded history in British Columbia from eating poisonous mushrooms is either 3 or 4, depending on your definition. And I'm guessing a lot of people here tonight were probably thinking some number in the hundreds. But keep in mind that it's much, much, much more likely, even if you forage a lot, much, much more likely that you'll die from being hit by lightning than by eating a poison mushroom. Okay? Pay attention, but don't lie awake at night frightened of mushrooms. Okay, fungi and forest ecology. I'm going to talk about fungi and forest ecology based in large part on what the fungi are doing in forested ecosystems. Remember, I said they were heterotrophs. That means they can't make their own food. Plants can make their own food. A few other groups of photosynthetic bacteria can make their own food. But everything else depends on those photosynthesizers for food, either directly or indirectly. So this is a lot about how fungi get their food, but it influences everything else about what they're doing in the ecosystems. Let's start with parasites then, which are fungi that obtain their nutrition from living hosts. And there's a lot of them. Here are a few common examples. Let's start at the top right here. If you're out picking any kind of blueberries or huckleberries, all of our vaccinium species, the plants that produce blueberries and huckleberries, are susceptible to infection by a rust called the fir blueberry rust. And rusts are a group of fungi that infect other plants, that parasitize other plants. They're very important economically in some cereal grains. They're called rusts because when they produce spores, they're oftentimes kind of a rusty orange color. And the fir blueberry rust, like some other complicated rusts, has 2 hosts, and it needs both hosts to complete its life cycle. So it has 5 different types of spores, 3 of which it produces on true fir trees in the genus Abies, and 2 of which it produces on vaccinium species, blueberries or huckleberries. And it produces 1 spore stage on a huckleberry, for example, that can only infect a fir tree, and 1 spore stage on a fir tree that can only infect a huckleberry, right? So it's really complicated. But if you come upon a blueberry or huckleberry that's got fat sausage-like branches like this, some of you have probably seen this in the woods, that's a huckleberry with a systemic infection from the fir blueberry rust. Generally, these fat stems, very few leaves, not at all good for the vaccinium, for the huckleberry or the blueberry, but for the rust, it's tricked that blueberry or the huckleberry into making a lot more surface area for it to fruit on. So keep an eye out for that in the woods. On the bottom left, powdery mildews, microscopic fungi that are parasites, in this case, of big leaf maple leaves. Ringworms are not worms at all, but are parasitic fungi, parasitic on us. So along with athlete's foot and a whole host of other fungal diseases that humans are susceptible to. And then on the top left, if you want to have great nightmares tonight, I recommend you go to YouTube and look up zombie ants. And cordyceps are a group of fungi that generally infect insects. They sometimes infect truffles in BC, but they're most famous for infecting insects, and they grow inside the live insect. While they're eating it, they direct the insect to do what the fungus wants them to do, which is why they're called zombies. The zombie ants are the most famous. And in those cases, the infected ant will walk away from its colony, climb up to a high, dry place, clamp its mandibles onto the underside of a leaf high up, all under the control of the fungus, of the cordyceps fungus. And then when the cordyceps has the ant positioned precisely where it wants it, it finishes killing it and produces its fruiting body right out the head of the ant. Cool, eh? Yeah. And shower spores down on the ant's friends down below to infect more ants and start the cycle all again. There are other kinds of parasites in British Columbia. The fat jack, which is a bolete mushroom in the top left there, is parasitized by another mushroom, Gomphidius oregonensis. And in this case, it's not the mushroom reaching out to the bolete, the other mushroom, but it's the microscopic threads in the soil that are parasitizing each other. We used to believe this mushroom in the foreground grew attached to the roots of trees because we always found it with conifer trees. But it turns out that the mushroom on the top grows attached to the roots of trees, and the mushroom of the bottom is always found associated with those trees because it's a parasite on the mushroom on the top. Life is complex. We have these zombie ant type fungi in British Columbia. Here on the dunes outside Ucluelet, for example, is a 10-line June beetle, which is parasitized by one of these cordyceps fungi. And in this case, again, the fungus makes the beetle do very unbeetle-like things like crawl up on top of the dunes where it can disperse its spores far and wide. And then when it's got the beetle where it wants it, it finishes killing the beetle. And in the case of the Ophiocordyceps ravenellii here, it produces twin fruiting bodies through the eyeball sockets of the dead beetle. Fabulous stuff. The two things that look kind of like legs with bent knees on the left there, those are the fruiting bodies of the fungus coming out of the eyeball sockets of the 10-lined June beetle on a dune near Ucluelet. Now, you may find the whole concept horrifying. I hope some of you do. Otherwise, you're a truly sick bunch of individuals. However, some people, including our two correspondents who sent me some pictures of these parasitized June beetles, are having a bit of fun with them here. On the bottom right, you can see they're considering eating them. There is a close relative from China and Tibet that is a very important medicinal in traditional Chinese medicine, as well as an aphrodisiac. Not sure if that's the effect they're going for here. Saprobes, so parasites, fungi that derive their nutrition from live hosts. Saprobes derive their nutrition from decaying organic matter, or dead hosts sometimes. So a lot of the small mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of fungi that are growing in the ground or in the wood and eating organic material in the ground or in the wood. And again, when they've got enough nutrition available and want to make sexual spores, they make these fantastic fruiting bodies like the orange peel fungus in the top left, the turkey tail on the top right, and another important medicinal, a lot of species of Mycena on the bottom left, and the spirit gummy bear. So named, that's a BC name, by the way, because it looks a bit like a gummy bear. It's gelatinous like a gummy bear, but it's got teeth underneath like a bear. And it's a spirit gummy bear because it's white like a spirit bear. So there's a made in BC name for you. These decomposers sometimes don't get the respect they deserve, but if these fungi, along with their insect and bacterial pals in the soil and in the wood, weren't decaying organic matter, very quickly the organic matter would reach the heights of the tree canopies and the whole system would grind to a halt. So these are critically important to ecosystem function, these decomposer fungi. The conchs are a good example of how things don't always fit into the categories we erect for them. This is the red-belled conch, probably BC's most common conch, and it will attack live trees. So it's a parasite, but then it will continue to decay the tree after it dies. So then it's a saprobe or decomposer. So sometimes the world doesn't fit nicely into our categories. This has been called forever Phomitopsis pinicola, and I don't usually dwell on things like scientific name changes, but in this case, Mount CE is named not only after a BC mycologist, which is unusual enough, but after a BC female mycologist, which is really uncommon. This is named for Irene Mounts, who studied the fungal decay of airplane grade Sitka spruce in Haida Gwaii during the 1940s, when Sitka spruce was still important for building aeroplanes for the war effort. And she ended up at the research station in Saanich near Swartz Bay Ferry Terminal. Some of you have probably driven by it a number of times. And in the early 1950s, she got married and promptly lost her job because at the time, the federal government did not employ married women. And that was the last I know of the history of Irene Mounts. I'm not sure what happened to her after that. But anyway, famous fungus named after Irene Mounts, a BC mycologist. Some fungi are predators. This will come as a surprise. Here are predators. Here are also predators. And it's, again, not the fruiting bodies, what we're looking at here that are the predators, but it's the microscopic filaments that are in the wood underneath these fruiting bodies. So if we look at micrographs, we can see that there are species like Arthrobotres in the top left there that makes these. Now, remember, these loops are so small, you need a very powerful microscope to see them. Makes these loops that nematodes, little tiny soil worms, will get their ends stuck in, and then these loops, the cells will inflate very, very quickly and trap the nematode there, so the fungus can then digest it at leisure. Must be a terrifying situation. In the top right there is Zoophagus, which makes adhesive pegs. Here it's trapping tiny rotifers. And the one you're probably most familiar with, the oyster mushroom on the bottom right there, it's hyphae, the microscopic threads are on the left there. You can see the droplets on them. They contain a substance called ostriatin, which paralyzes very small creatures so that the fungus can then digest them. So it's worth remembering, a little note for the vegetarians in the crowd, that oyster mushrooms are carnivores. And symbionts. And this is in a lot of ways the most interesting. And I'm going to cover it quite briefly, but I suspect that there will be lots of opportunities for questions and discussions afterwards. I talked about how plants and fungi work together in a lot of different arrangements, where the plant photosynthesizes, makes the food, and the fungus provides something else to the plant. And these partnerships are common, widespread, and important. Here's an example of one I'm not going to talk about, but every single species of plant that people have looked at on Earth has microscopic fungi living inside its leaves and twigs. Lots of microscopic fungi. And in the vast majority of cases, we have no clue what they're doing there. The fungi are probably eating the sugars the plants are producing. Well, they're certainly doing that. What they're giving the plants in return, we have no idea. We have some speculation, though. This is an interesting example. I just wanted to talk about Western yew because those of you who have been around for a while will remember in the early 1990s, we had a bit of a mini gold rush in British Columbia when it was discovered that you could extract Taxol from the bark of Western yew. And this became very quickly and remains to this day one of the most important chemotherapeutic drugs, especially for treating breast and ovarian cancers. And in BC, there was a mini gold rush stripping the bark and so killing yew trees and actually wiping out yew trees in part of their range in southwestern BC and the West Kootenays. However, as it turns out, when people started looking at the endophytic fungi, now this is European yew, not our yew here, they found 242 species of fungi growing inside the twigs of the European yew, probably something similar in our Western yew, and 2 of them produce Taxol, which means that it's probably not the Western yew that's producing the Taxol. It's probably the fungi growing inside its twigs that are producing the Taxol. And that may be the case for a lot of compounds we associate with particular plants. It may very well be that a lot of those compounds are being produced by fungi, which are much more interesting chemical factories than plants in general. Okay, lichens. We have lots of species of lichens in British Columbia. They're beautiful. It's a partnership between 1 or more species of fungi and 1 or more species of algae and or cyanobacteria. When they have fungi, algae, and cyanobacteria, it's a partnership between 3 kingdoms of life. Absolutely extraordinary from a biological point of view. Fascinating organisms, beautiful. If you're interested in lichens, let's talk more at the end of the talk. Mycorrhizae. Probably a lot of people here are familiar with the concept. Mycorrhiza means fungus root. And more than 90% of higher plant species, of vascular plant species on Earth, their roots are associated with fungi in a mycorrhiza. So that means that almost all plant species, vascular plant species, have mycorrhizae. And it's also something that we see in the earliest fossils of land plants and is probably how plants manage to make it on the land, is with the assistance of fungi. So when you see something that's as widespread and ancient, as ubiquitous as mycorrhizae, you know it's important. When you go for a walk in the woods, almost every plant you see has fungi associated with its roots. The fungi help the plants grow, help the plants obtain minerals, water, other nutrients. The fungi also produce fruiting bodies that in BC oftentimes are mushrooms. If anybody's read Suzanne Simard's excellent book, Finding the Mother Tree, you'll know that the situation is much more complex than that. When we did a study in the Victoria watershed looking at Douglas fir trees and mycorrhizae, we found on average 12 or 14 different species of fungi on the roots of each Douglas fir tree. And those fungi were connected to multiple Douglas fir trees. So you don't have a plant and its mycorrhizal fungus, you have a network of mycorrhizae throughout the forest floor connecting all the trees. And we know that the plants, including the trees in the forest, are transferring water, minerals, sugars, and signaling hormones through this common mycorrhizal network. It's amazing stuff. Not really enough time this morning to get into this in any length, but there are lots of different kinds of mycorrhizae. The important thing is worldwide, most mycorrhizae are arbuscular mycorrhizae, but in BC, an awful lot of the mycorrhizae are ectomycorrhizae up in the top left. Don't worry too much about what an ectomycorrhiza is. If you're really interested, I'll explain afterwards. The important thing to remember is that the fungi in an ectomycorrhizae have as their fruiting bodies mushrooms. And almost every large mushroom species you can think of in British Columbia, including all the ones that people like to gather and eat, are all the fruiting bodies of ectomycorrhizal fungi. They're all the fruiting bodies of fungi growing attached to the roots of trees. That's why you go looking for most of your favorite wild mushrooms in forests, and why if people cut down the forests, the mushrooms disappear. What can't be demonstrated in forests because of the complexity of the ecosystems, but has been demonstrated quite clearly in laboratories, is if you get rid of the tree, the fungus will die. But if you get rid of the fungus, the tree will die. Go out in the autumn, almost all the large mushrooms you see, without exception, are the fruiting bodies of fungi growing attached to the roots of trees. And finally, mycoheterotrophs. These are vascular plants that lack chlorophyll. Like the most common in British Columbia is the ghost pipe on the left there, Monotropa uniflora. How does it derive its nutrition? It's got no chlorophyll, it can't photosynthesize. But however, like almost all plants, it has fungi associated with its roots. It has mycorrhizae. And like almost all mycorrhizal fungi, those fungi are also attached to the roots of other plants. So in this case, the fungi that are attached to the roots of ghost pipe are also attached to the roots of nearby Douglas fir trees. The Douglas fir trees can photosynthesize, send sugars down to their roots to feed the fungus. The fungus takes some of those sugars, transfers them over to the ghost pipe, and that's how the ghost pipe is fed. The fruiting body, the short-footed russula on the bottom right there, again, one of BC's most common mushrooms, is the fruiting body of the fungus that connects the ghost pipe to the Douglas fir. Mycoheterotrophs, a great term to use at your next cocktail party. BC's got more than 3,400 species of mushrooms that we have documented, that people have documented so far. We suspect there are probably at least 10,000 species of mushrooms in British Columbia. It's a very poorly known group. If anyone here tonight wants to become a mycologist, there's a lifetime's worth of adventure in front of you. We have so many different types of fungi, of mushrooms, because we have so many different types of ecosystems. This is a map of the ecological zones of British Columbia. There's more climatic and ecological complexity in British Columbia than in any other province or territory or just about anywhere else in the whole world at temperate latitudes. An extraordinary place to be a biologist. One thought I want to leave you with here, there's only been one detailed study in British Columbia of the association of different mushrooms with their habitats. So in this case, this took place in Clayoquot Sound. 6 habitats were sampled from 1997 to 2001. The 6 habitats were dune, spruce fringe, old growth forest, second growth forest, bog, and estuary. Over that period, they collected 551 species of macrofungi, think species of mushrooms. 17 to 36% of the species in a habitat were found only in that one habitat. And remember, they're only doing this by documenting the fruiting bodies they see above ground. So of the 551 species they found, only 28 of them were found every year, and 308 of them were found only in 1 year. So obviously, if you want to do a fungal survey of an area, you need to do it over many, many years. And then finally, and the one I'd like to leave you with for my own personal reasons here, is that old growth forest had approximately 4 times as many species as bog and estuarine habitats, and 1.5 times as many species as the rest. So as if you needed any more reasons to protect old growth forests, do it for the mushrooms that live there. Thanks. And with that, I will turn it back to Adam.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for that very interesting presentation. It's incredible. And it's, I think, truly a good reason for us to fight for biodiversity. Because as we are shredding the landscape, there's so much of it that we don't know. How much do we know about fungi and mushrooms? And like, I know it's a really tough question because you don't know what you don't know, but so much of this is unknown, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's something that everybody should keep in their back pocket. When people say, why do we need to protect these forests into the future? I say, well, knowing some of these groups of organisms, I think I can safely say we don't know the names of half of the species that live there. We don't know, we know almost nothing about the bacteria, the viruses, very little about the fungi. Most of the other small groups of organisms are largely unknown. And we suspect that in British Columbia, we might have on the order of 10,000 species of mushrooms. I would describe that as a wild ass guess. I saw an estimate of the number of bird species globally at one point, and I cannot remember the number, but it was plus or minus 30 or 40 species, depending on how it worked out.
Right.
And we suspect the number of fungal species globally is probably between 3 and 25 million, but we're not sure. Which is to say that we probably can't say with any degree of certainty what the number of fungal species is globally within an order of magnitude.
Have you run into a species that serves no purpose?
No, other than politicians. But no, aside from that, Adam.
No, species of mud. Come on. Let's stick to the topic here.
No. I mean,
right.
all creatures are out there doing their thing, and they're decomposing, or they're killing, they're bringing life to they're critical components of the ecosystem. There are a number of species out there we don't know the names of, and most of the ones we know the names of, we can't be 100% certain what they're doing out there. So one of the main reasons I give for protecting some of these areas is so that we can eventually try and learn a little bit about them. One of the most sobering articles I've ever read was written by the entomologist Neville Winchester and Richard Ring at the University of British Columbia. He was studying canopy arthropods, insects and arachnids that live in the canopies of old growth forests. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a paper, they wrote a paper on something he called centennial extinctions. And he says, imagine what the canopy communities were like in the old growth forests in the coastal Douglas fir zone. Says if they're anything like other canopy communities we've looked at, they're full of species new to science, species we don't know from anywhere else. He says, and whatever those species were in the old growth forests of the coastal Douglas fir zone, they're gone. Centennial extinctions are extinctions of species before we even knew they existed. Mm-hmm. And that's probably going on an awful lot in British Columbia.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. And this is the first presentation that I've seen that is an hour in, and we're still adding people to it. So welcome to the new people that have joining us, Andy and Andy Mackinnon. Just a quick note here. Andy, in lieu of a speaker's fee and in lieu of charging, the BC Greens Saanich North and the Island Riding Association at one point a long time ago used to host this meeting in person at the McTavish Academy of the Arts. And we used to charge a nominal fee in order for us to secure the venue and for a small fundraising for the Riding Association. However, when we went online, we stopped doing that. And instead, we ask our speakers who are donating their time, who we could request people make a small donation to if it's in the budget and in their hearts to do it. And Andy has considered a charity in my riding, the Kingfisher Forest on Pender Island, supported by Raincoast. And as well, of course, as is an important for Canadians to be doing now, is the Canadian Red Cross and the Ukrainian Humanitarian Crisis Appeal. You can find links to both of those in the chat box. And I hope that you will consider making a small contribution. As well, 2 of Andy's books will be up for door prizes this evening. And we're going to get to that in a few minutes, but it's based on your birth date. Now, we don't need your year, but basically the 2 people whose birthday is closest to Andy's 2 birth dates. He was born on midnight, exactly on midnight. So either one of them will take. There's not too much space between the 2 days, only a matter of a second, but nonetheless, born exactly on midnight. And so we'll get to that in just a few minutes as well. If you have a question, please drop it either in the chat or in the Q&A. I see a few questions here already. I have one to get us started. You were talking about the June beetle, and you were talking kind of putting into, I think, anthropomorphizing the fungus, saying that the fungus gets the beetle to go to a certain place. And in a couple of these fungus seem to direct their host to do things on their behalf. Is there any understanding how this happens? And the question that came to my mind as you're saying is, how does the fungus know is where it's supposed to be in order to do that very important task that it wants the beetle to do? Do we have any understanding of this? It's fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't delve into it for matters of time and also for terrifying people even more. I would encourage you to go to YouTube. There's a couple of great David Attenborough features on zombie ants, but there was a great paper last year, which was one that I found really, really terrifying. It was based on histological studies where they get ants in different degrees of infection, and they preserve them and they cut slices through them to look at what parts of the ant the fungus is infiltrating. And I was almost able to live with the whole zombie ant concept if the fungi were somehow getting into the brains of the ants and simply directing the ants to go places they didn't want to go. Based on this study from last year, that's not what's happening. The fungus does not enter the ant's brain. Instead, it goes to the motor muscles associated with the different limbs. And so, I can understand a fungus directing an ant through its brain because the ant brain knows how to coordinate the movement of 6 limbs. Apparently, that's not how it works. Apparently, the fungus is coordinating the independent movement of 6 limbs to move that ant from one place to another. Now, for me, that's even more terrifying.
Remarkable. But that does kind of play out in other instances as well. Like when we watched a fascinating Netflix series, and it really put into visual what the fungus is doing in the ground underneath an old growth forest. Mm-hmm. And it really is a communication superhighway. Really, it's much like the network that our computers are all tied to tonight. So we don't. It's not unique to see fungus having that kind of capacity, I guess.
No, fungi rule the world, Adam. Suzanne Simard, in her the first paper she published from her PhD thesis, she wrote the excellent. She's a good friend of some decades now. Wrote the excellent book Finding the Mother Tree, but published a paper from her PhD in Nature, and the cover of Nature said "The Wood Wide Web."
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, it's an excellent pun, and makes that point that the structure in some ways is like that of the internet. Now, here's a question on chat. Hi, Andy. What do you have to say about the recent news of BC Timber Sales pest management plan to use glyphosate, triclopyr, and 2,4-D for controlling, quote, weeds, unquote? I'm somewhere between disappointed and appalled, and I think not for the reason that a lot of people would necessarily be appalled, which is that they're spraying an awful lot of herbicides all over the landscape, some of which are now known to bioaccumulate in the soil. But certainly the work of Suzanne and others demonstrates the importance of having a diversity of plant species in these forest ecosystems, with their diversity of mycorrhizae, making connections through the forest stand. And the intent of applying all these pesticides is to get rid of just about everything but the crop trees. To simplify that stand, to simplify the plant community, to simplify the mycorrhizal network in the soil. And that's a large chunk of what Suzanne's book is about. Of course, that's going to kill an awful lot of these plants that they're targeting, but it's also profoundly unhealthy for the crop trees they're trying to manage for. And so I'm really disappointed and appalled at an announcement like that. Not so much because of the widespread use of poison, which ought to be a concern to everybody, but more so because of the intent and the actuality of simplifying those plant communities in a way that's not healthy for the ecosystem, or even in the end, have a look at Suzanne's book, healthy for the crop trees that they're trying to manage for.
I've raised the point over the last few days in the legislature that it is an act of environmental racism, frankly, because the species that they are trying to get rid of are all species that are native. First of all, they're not pests. They may be pests to a tree farm, but they're all species that Indigenous people have harvested for food and for medicines forever. And so it's an act of, on one hand, as we try to advance reconciliation. On the other hand, we have a policy with the Ministry of Forests that food security must be viewed through a very narrow lens of industrial food production. It's very troubling on that angle as well, but that's a different presentation.
Okay. But may I weigh in 100% with you on that, Adam? I mean, I have spent a good part of my career working with, writing about plants, about the incredible diversity of plants that enriches our lives here in British Columbia and Western Canada. And the use of pesticides, the broadcast use of pesticides like this is just the antithesis of that celebration of diversity. Before you even get into the importance of a number of these plants for food, medicine, or other technological uses by local communities, including, of course, First Nations.
Well said. To Heather, who just asked the question, what can civilians do? Civilians can write the Minister of Forests. Civilians can write my office as an MLA, my constituency office, and write your MLA, and just let them know exactly how you feel about this. We've received 2,000 emails over the course of about a week. That's way more now. So certainly a big issue. Okay, back to some of the questions here, specifically about fungi. Susan Battle asks, what significance of is of the color of the fungi, and how do they get their colors and the diversity of colors, I guess?
Okay. And the answer is we don't know. There's you would have to ask the mushrooms, but it's one of the most delightful things about fungi. I worked with plants, as I said, for many, many years. Fascinating in a lot of ways, but they're all kind of green. Fungi come in all the colors of the rainbows. We understand that some of the colors come from compounds that are used as sunscreen by these fungi. There are some groups of fungi that, in order to disperse their spores, have to be eaten. And they can oftentimes use colors to make themselves obvious, or even sometimes resembling berries, for example. But there are probably lots of fungi that are lots of different colors as a consequence of producing these fungal compounds for other purposes, and incidentally, it renders them that color. So there are whole groups of fungi that we think are probably all doing roughly the same thing in the ecosystem, where you can find, even within one genus, fungi that are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, a whole rainbow of colors, even within different species within one genus. And there are even some species, for example, very confusing, of genera like Russula, some very common mycorrhizal mushrooms, where even within one species, what we describe as one species of mushroom, you can get everything from white to pinkish to green and blue tones. So some of it for certain is not necessarily adaptive for any particular purpose, certainly not any purpose we can identify, and in all likelihood, not any particular, they're not adaptations for a particular lifestyle, but are instead a reflection of compounds that are produced for other purposes by the mushroom and make them incidentally scarlet.
The animals and plants that are poisonous carry the warning on their back. If you're paying close attention, is the same for fungi. If you are paying attention, does their color let you know if they should or should not be eaten, or is that less of an issue when it comes to fungi?
Not at all, Adam. No, it's not. There are no clues with fungi about with mushrooms in general about being eaten or not. The most poisonous mushroom within your constituency, of course, is the famous death cap mushroom. And it's a beautiful mushroom, but its color is rather unremarkable. Usually whitish with some yellowish or yellowish green tinge to it, but nothing that would catch your eye or warn you against it. And in fact, by some accounts, is an absolutely delicious mushroom. One of our tastiest. The only problem is you die an agonizing death afterwards.
Not worth tempting your taste buds, from what it sounds like. Okay, anybody who's put their birthdays, I see Christine's added their birthday to the question and answer. If you could please put your birth date and month in the chat instead, then we can keep them all in one place.
I can see. Oh,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, it says here from Corrine, this was wonderfully scientific. Could you do another talk on lichens, similarly scientific in the future? Absolutely. There are some other lichenologists I could recommend who have been studying lichens certainly a lot more than I have. That would be excellent resources as well. So if you would like to do something like that in the future, I can certainly put you in touch with those wonderful people.
I had the wonderful opportunity to ask a question in the legislature a couple of weeks back about the old growth specklebelly lichen.
Excellent. Pseudocyphalaria. Yeah.
Which unfortunately was laying all over the forest floor up in Fairy Creek. But nonetheless, the predominance of lichen and the connection, of course, great food for old growth lichen are great food for caribou, and one of the reasons why that species is having such a difficult time as well. So Risa Smith asked Andy, is there a role for viruses as intermediaries between plants and fungi?
Okay, that's a good question. And I haven't seen any literature on that at all, Risa. I would be surprised if there's not. Certainly, it's well known that a lot of fungi host viruses. And I know that that may very well be one way for vertical transmission from, there's a lot of literature out there about how these endophytic fungi, the microscopic fungi in the plants, get from one plant to another. And some of it may be viral transfer, some of it may be via seeds, but there's got to be some mechanism for these endophytic fungi to make their way from parent plants to their offspring. And in some of them, it's certainly not through seeds, and virus may play an important role there. But I haven't actually seen a lot of literature on it. Well, thank goodness Risa is young and can begin yet another PhD on that topic.
Many
I've got here, Andy, I was spored by an elfin saddle mushroom that I handled, not picked, to get a photo. I subsequently got an itchy rash that spread over my limbs. It took months to get over it. The doc told me that it shoots its spores from the cap. Well, it does. Absolutely. The elfin saddle is one of the ascomycetes. And so it's got those asci on it, those long sacs that each contains 8 spores. And it shoots them off. It can shoot them off with a great amount of force. So I oftentimes encourage people, maybe I should stop doing it, if they find an elfin saddle, to stick it right in their ear, because it's one of the few mushrooms that you can actually listen to. There's a lot of mushrooms, they say, what does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste? But elfin saddles, if you stick it right into your ear, you can actually hear what sounds like static, which is the sound of the elfin saddle asci firing their spores off into your ear canal, and is a really cool thing to listen to in the field. However, I've never heard of anyone getting an itchy rash from the spores. That's most unusual. Well, not only most unusual, it's the first time I've heard of it, but certainly they do shoot off their spores. Certainly everybody who wanders through the woods ends up with spores all over their body every time they do it. Fortunately, most of us don't end up with a rash from getting fungal spores all over their body every time they go for a walk in the woods. But I'm sorry that Moni did. Gosh, I've never heard of that before. That's extraordinary. Maybe I'll stop telling people to stick them right into their ears to listen to them. But it sure is fun to do. You get an incredible static sound, and then you can tell your friends you've been listening to mushrooms.
And they might think something else about that as well. So Andy, Mary Leslie asked the question as to whether or not animals have the same reaction to poisonous mushrooms as people. Negatively affected?
And the answer is some do and some don't, and it depends how closely related they are to us, and more to the point, how closely related their digestive system is to us.
Right.
Just as an example, slugs very commonly graze a lot of mushrooms that would poison humans. And so it's actually not that uncommon to come across some fairly poisonous mushrooms with chunks taken out of them from banana slugs, say.
Right.
On the other hand, some small mammals do get poisoned by poisonous mushrooms that would poison us. So I don't think you can generalize about animals. And unfortunately, there's been a couple of questions here. There's no way to generalize about how to tell whether a mushroom is poisonous or not. You really have to identify that mushroom and then determine whether that particular species is a poisonous mushroom. There aren't an awful lot of them, but you need to know what they look like if you're going to be gathering for the table.
This process of understanding, this would have been done, what, over many, many years, hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years of people testing and finding a way to be able to test for the impacts of this. Has there ever been any work done to understand how we've come to understand how mushrooms impact and or the poisonous and not poisonous, and what the process is for that?
Not too much, Adam, because I think for most of these species, this happened millennia ago.
Sure.
Sorting out which ones were tasty and which ones were poisonous, and so those tales are lost in the annals of time. It would be interesting to study it for a newly arrived species. The death cap, for example, is an introduced mushroom that was brought into British Columbia, has been introduced over actually a number of places around the world. So it'd be interesting to see what the learning curve, the recent learning curve is for a species like that. It's also fascinating to me that we have a rich ethnobotanical literature for British Columbia, talking about the traditional use of plants for millennia in British Columbia. And we have no corresponding ethnomycological literature. There are a few references here and there about traditional use of fungi by First Nations in British Columbia. But for the most part, either most fungi were not widely employed by First Nations in British Columbia, or perhaps they were so important to some ceremonies that they just wouldn't tell the people writing it down about them.
Yeah,
I'm not
there's
sure.
a lot of that. There's a lot of
I'm guessing. Yeah, I'm not sure where that all, but it's notable. I talked about the museum series of handbooks. Of course, there are some great handbooks by Nancy Turner and collaborators on ethnobotany in British Columbia. Okay. Nothing on ethnomycology.
Well, there you go. Your next phase with Indigenous people. The question was from Mary, asking about Kingfisher Forest. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about Kingfisher Forest and why it is that you've chosen them to receive a contribution if people are able to do that? Sure.
I've been working with the Pender Island Naturalists and Raincoast Conservation and others to try and raise funds to buy the Kingfisher Forest on Pender Island for a park for the island. I've been previously involved in fundraising for other parks on Pender Island over the years. Brooks Point comes to mind back in the days when I was working a lot with the Habitat Acquisition Trust. And it's just a beautiful piece of land that will connect upland forest right down to the ocean, looks over an area that's frequented by orcas, and connects with some other protected areas. And I think any piece of land in the coastal Douglas fir that we have an opportunity to protect for future generations is priceless. Like a lot of the coastal Douglas fir zone, there's been logging there. And so as I've told a number of different people, if we want to have old growth forest in the coastal Douglas fir zone for future generations, we're going to have to grow our own old growth. Now that's, for me, that's part of what the Kingfisher Forest is all about. It was also quite fun. I'm going to be back there doing some more work this weekend, but they asked me out there before, and I got to film a video that had May Moore in it. And so I got to meet May Moore, which was very cool. I grew up listening to her music and being a huge fan. So it was very, very cool to go over there and meet her.
I've dropped a link to the raincoast.org for people to go and check out what it is that they're doing over on Pender Island. And certainly there are incredible and very active conservation groups. All of the islands have conservancies, and it's been one of the wonderful things that I've got to explore is the MLA for this for the Gulf Islands.
So here's a question, Adam. It says, do you know of edible mushroom groups near Nanaimo or Penticton? And certainly there are Nanaimo members in the South Vancouver Island Mycological Society. So we have two mushroom clubs in BC, the South Vancouver Island Mycological Society, which is headquartered in Victoria. And I'm a member of that one. I'm the past president. And the Vancouver Mycological Society, which is headquartered in Vancouver, of course. However, there are very keen groups in a number of different nodes around the province. And I've found that the absolute best way to get started is to contact the local natural history societies. So we only have the two mushroom clubs, but there are usually keen mushroomers associated with the natural history societies in the different communities. So that's what I'd check out if I was in Nanaimo or Penticton.
Awesome. Great advice. One final question here before we wrap up here, Andy, and figure out who we're going to be giving the door prizes to. One question: does the chemical structure of fungi change when it's cooked, i.e., raw versus cooked flavors?
Oh yeah, very much so. And we always encourage people to cook mushrooms before they eat them, both from the digestibility point of view, but also for some species, there are some compounds which are relatively inedible, which will disappear upon cooking. It's really hard to generalize. It's kind of like saying, how do you cook vegetables? Right.
There's somewhere between 3 and 25 million species. So
yeah,
there's probably somewhere between 3 and 25 million different outcomes, right?
Well, quite right. And that's before you even find out what the French do to them. But yes, definitely we encourage people to cook their wild mushroom harvest, both for taste and safety, but also for digestibility.
Awesome. Well, Andy, I think everybody learned a whole bunch more about the wonderful world of fungi that's all around us. Absolutely everywhere where we see life, we will find fungi. And I think we all definitely enjoyed this this evening. I'm going to welcome, I hope Tex is there, or somebody. Tex, there he is.
Have we sitting in the dark?
Have we heard? Oh, go.
We've got two book winners tonight. We have John Healy and Glenn Evans.
Nice.
Because Andy, your birthday is August
30th, August 29th and 30th.
And his driver's license says the 30th.
That's right. Yeah.
So Glenn and John, if you would just drop us an email and tell us a bit more about how we can get some books to you, we'll be happy to do that. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Andy, for a great evening. I've sat in on lots of talks. I did a lot of mold work with CMHC and worked with a lot of mycologists. And let me tell you, you had a whole lot of information that I can't recall hearing much about in those sessions. So thank you for that. For those of you who are members of our writing association, let me remind you that we have our AGM coming up. And so if couple things: one, we need you there, and two, if you thought you might like to join us on the executive and have any questions, you're welcome to get in touch with me. And Andy, you've just signed off, but once again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Adam, I'll throw it back to you, and I think I've more or less said what I needed to say, and we'll look forward to another season of Voices of Saanich and the Islands next year.
Yeah, so two things before we let Andy go. I'll just say this, with respect to the Writing Association and the work that we do in Saanich North and the Islands, I hope that if there's anybody that has a small amount of time to be able to dedicate to keeping the presence of our party, the BC Greens, in Saanich North and the Islands, joining the Writing Association is a great way to help. And I certainly hope that if you have some time that you will consider that. We're very lucky and very blessed to be in this riding, and I'm very grateful for all of the work that everybody does to keep us moving. And so I just want to echo the comment that that Tex just made. And Andy, I just want to say to you that I am very grateful, always grateful, for your wisdom and for your courage and for your willingness to stand up and speak the truth when it needs to be said, and what needs to be said when it needs to be said. You're a very powerful advocate for nature and for biodiversity and for all things good. And I just I have a huge spot in my heart for you, and I just wanted to say that this evening. I really have a great deep respect for you. So thank you for all that you do. You're muted. So
thanks so much, everybody. I appreciate it. Very kind.
And thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. We will return with another season of Voices of Saanich. We'll take the last part of spring and the summer off and let people go. And then in the fall and winter, we will return with another series of great speakers. We will be sharing this, the recording of this, to all of the people that joined this evening, and you can share this out to your contacts. Thank you, Tex, for organizing this. Thank you to Linda and to all of the Writing Association, to Paul and to the BC Greens for hosting this on our channel. So thank you all this evening, and have a wonderful evening.